So could you tell us about your decision to make this book? You mentioned discussions with other historians and archivists, but was there an initial impetus or a moment that really sparked it? Or something about your career and your expertise that influenced the decision made you feel called to make it?
At the time when the pandemic broke, I was a newly appointed borough historian for Manhattan, and that's a state post. I was put in the post by Gail Brewer, who was then Manhattan Borough President. And when the pandemic started to begin, I didn't know anything about pandemics, viruses, medicine, public health. So the first thing I did was start to call historians who were knowledgeable. I mean, David Rosner, who's sitting there, was one of them. Janet Golden at Rutgers, Newark was others. And we soon convened a group of people who met online. And we pretty early on concluded that the pandemic was going to be hugely important in the history of New York City. How, we didn't know, but we knew it was going to be big. And as time passed, I began to think about how to best help understand this episode for future generations. There's a lot of oral history work being done. There was a lot of archival work being done. Lots of photographers and folklorists were going out. And gradually I warmed to the idea of putting all their work in one book that would record what it was like to live through this terrible experience. It wouldn't be a history of COVID. I didn't feel competent to write that because I think you have to be solid in biology, medicine, and all sorts of fields that are way beyond me. But at the same time, I thought we need to preserve for future generations what this was like in the most generous way possible.
So as an archive, we are particularly interested in process of saving history. And as you mentioned, there were a lot of archival and oral history projects happening at the time. A lot of people recording their story, realizing they were living through a historical moment. How did you select from that vast amount of material what you would include, and when in that process did a structure kind of reveal itself to you?
It was very difficult to make the choices. I mean, one of the things that actually motivated me to do this was the fact that early on in the pandemic it became clear that transit workers, and I am the grandson of a transit worker, were suffering at a terrible rate. That more than 130 of them died during the pandemic. And there was no record of transit workers. In the hundreds of oral history interviews that I looked at, there was maybe one interview with a transit worker. So I decided I was going to keep faith with Grandpa and do those interviews myself, but then I was going to bring in as many voices as I could of essential workers. Because everybody coped, everybody suffered, and I pretty quickly could come up with a category called coping and suffering. But after I did that, I thought, what's the third category? And the third category in my mind had to be essential workers. Because when all the city's institutions were failing for one reason or another, the city was saved from the bottom up by the people who drove buses and subways, by the people who went to work in hospitals, by the people who delivered food, and their experiences needed to be recorded because there were so many ways of experiencing the pandemic that there was very little common ground that helped people understand other lives. But by putting as many as I could into one book, coping, suffering, which we all did, but then working, which only a relatively modest number of people did, that would help us move forward with some knowledge of what our different experiences were.
Sounds like you were seeing kind of the invisible infrastructure that was keeping the city going and sought to document that specifically. Did that help you in selecting which stories would be included?
It was really hard to make the choice. And of the hundreds of interviews that I looked at, you could have constructed a different book. It would be entirely possible. You could have constructed a funnier book. There were some stories of two sisters in the Bronx, I'll never forget them, who scheduled a weekly dance party. On Friday afternoons, they would blast the music and just dance all day, and then get on with the rest of their week. A woman who created a gym in her apartment. I mean, she went to a sporting goods store, bought a barbell, and then figured out how to swing jugs of water from the barbell so she could lift weights at home and stay in shape. There are a lot of stories like that, but in the end, I thought it was more important to get at the stories of work in all its forms.
That's a really interesting point, because there were a lot of ways you could approach the material, and I felt like the book walks this line of dealing with an incredibly heavy topic, a traumatic one, but finding moments of hope, of inspiration. But I'm curious, as you went through all this material, how you found that balance of portraying the nuances of the experience, but also for yourself, how did you navigate the emotional weight and toll it could take to go through this archival material that was still really happening?
That's a great question. There were moments in doing the interviews that were really hard. I think of a woman I interviewed named Veronica Fletcher. Her husband, Trevor Fletcher, was a transit worker. He was a mechanic. He absolutely loved his job. He died of COVID. And she wanted to provide a record of her husband's life and his death. And as we get closer and closer to his death in the interview, which is conducted over Zoom, she starts crying. Then I start crying. I've been doing interviews for like more than 50 years. I never broke down in an interview before. But on this one, I started crying. And I said to her, look, if you want to stop, we can stop. She goes, no, I want to do this. I want to do this. I must do this. And I said to her, if you can do it, then I'm going to do it too. Let's keep at it. So it was difficult at times, but that was the most difficult episode. There were other episodes that I found utterly inspiring. I'm thinking of Patricia Chu from Queens, who went home every day after working really hard shifts in her hospital and sat down in front of her phone and recorded videotaped testimony for her fellow nurses about what they could expect the next day when they went into work. So she would steel them for what they were going to have to face. And you know, compared to what Veronica suffered and what Patricia did, I didn't feel like I did anything that big. You know, I worked from the back of my apartment. I was really safe. I went out for walks late at night when there was nobody on the street. And I felt that I didn't put myself at risk. I didn't do anything brave.
I think a lot of people felt that conflict of staying safe by staying inside and also wanting to contribute if they had the luxury to not go in person to work. But I think one of the things that you're really getting at in this conversation is the difficulty, the challenges, and the importance of doing recent history. And I think that presents its own set of choices, and I just want to hear about what it was like to do this, say, in comparison to books you've written about people long gone, not going through something that, I mean, you could argue today we're still experiencing the COVID pandemic. So how does the doing recent history compare?
It's harder because you know they can call you if they don't like the way it came out. I mean, it's easy to write about dead people. You know, they don't bother you. And when I was a journalist, there's something I was acutely aware of, right? You know, if I get this quote wrong, if I misrepresent this person, they can run me down, they can yell at me. It's happened to me, you know, in my life as a journalist, but it makes you more cautious. And on this one, I made a very deliberate decision that after I edited all the interviews, that I would show them to the narrators and say, did my edits, which are designed to condense the interview, make it readable and make it clear for people, if I distorted any of your meanings, let me know. And I'm really proud, nobody had any problem with my edits. They were perfectly comfortable with them.
Historians do like to hide in the past, and sometimes we have to talk to real people who have opinions. But I mean, that's really interesting, because I think a lot of times people just want to hear their stories told and appreciate a good faith effort doing that. That sounds like what you kind of experienced, no pushback, really?
They do want to hear it, although there was one person I interviewed who I will never forget. He was a police officer. His name's Richard Brea. He commanded precincts in the Bronx, and he talked about what it was like to run a police precinct during COVID. But when I reached him through a colleague who teaches at John Jay College, he said to me, "But I don't want to talk about politics. You understand that? I don't want to talk about politics." And several times in the interview, when it even came close to politics, "That's politics. I'm not going there." I said, "Okay, all right, we're just going to talk about COVID." And then at the end of the interview, I asked him my standard question: "Is there anything that I didn't ask you that you want to talk about?" And he goes, "Yes," and he unloads on Mayor de Blasio. I go, "You want that in the interview?" He said, "Absolutely."
Deny. That's incredible. I mean, I think it was a time where people couldn't separate the political from the personal, the individual from the communal. All of these lines were getting blurred. When we were putting together the excerpt, the piece that you all saw from the student, that was from different points in his interview, and you can hear the contrast. At one point he's talking about witnessing police brutality of an essential worker, and then the next he's talking about New Yorkers taking care of each other. And so we wanted to show both sides of that one interview. It spans so much.
I think that's a great point. So at one point in the book, I really wrestled with how do I establish the order of this book? Like, how do I periodize it, right? Like, what time period do we cover? And the first thing I came up with is, okay, from the moment the emergency is declared to when President Biden says no more emergency in 2023. What's the midpoint in that? And I concluded, well, it's when vaccines are introduced, right? Because I think you could sense in the interviews a change in tone after the vaccines got introduced. In many ways, the vaccines became a big issue on people's minds in all sorts of ways. The other thing that happened, and Amy Starczewski at the Columbia Oral History Project made this point, that early in the pandemic, and you saw this in the interviews, people would say again and again, "This is terrible, but on the other side of this, we have to create a better world. We can't endure this and have nothing come of it." And I had all sorts of visions of what that would turn out to be when that moment came. None of them come to pass, really. But at the same time that people are saying that, later in the interviews, you see doctors say it, you see some of the nurses say it too. They describe their jobs and say, "This is not what I signed up for. This is just not what I signed up for. I'm not helping people heal, I'm managing their slow decline." And for a lot of doctors and nurses, that was very, very, very hard. And I think it's one of the reasons you got so many nurses, just leaving after the pandemic, because they had just been through a hellish experience that they didn't want to go through again.
Well, I mean, you say you had participants who didn't want to bring in politics, but you're the historian framing this book, right? And you mentioned in your introduction the defunding of public services and the fiscal crisis that led to a neoliberal city. I'm curious to hear how you found a balance in how much of your own voice as a historian you put, and how much you let the interviews speak for themselves.
I deliberately muted my own voice because I wanted the narrators to stand out. And yet for me, the pandemic revealed in stark detail some fundamental truths about the city that I already knew. I already knew it from research I'd done for another book, that New York City over recent decades has gotten more and more unequal, more and more stratified, and its healthcare system, while famous for some of its hospitals, doesn't serve everybody in the same way. And that was just highlighted during the pandemic. And to me, one of the truths about New York City is in the last 50 years of its history, immigration has transformed and saved New York City from a very difficult period in its history. The pandemic is a terrible kick in the pants for the people and communities who brought New York City back from hard times.
Well, I want to make sure we have a chance for people in the audience to ask you questions. So my last question before the classic one that you mentioned of, is there anything else you'd like to add? I'd like to hear a little bit about what your vision is for this book now that it's out in the world. You mentioned that you wrote that if this provides inspiration or surprise to anybody, it's done its job. Has that changed at all as you've been meeting people, talking to people about the book, and in our kind of, years pass between when you write something and when it comes out? And I'm wondering, given our current political climate, or what you're seeing happening in public health sectors, or public services, or labor, immigration, has there been a change for you in how you interpret the work or how you hope it is received?
Yeah, I mean, one thing is, I think that there's a need for more research. There's a need for more history. And in that sense, I think we ought to do more research with people who are vaccine skeptics, who didn't want to get vaccinated, who didn't want to wear masks. What led them to this conclusion? I actually looked for interviews like that. I found one or two, but in the long run, they didn't work that great. And after a lot of thought, and they didn't work that great, to be candid, because I thought they contained a lot of disinformation that was unchallenged in the interview. And I didn't want somebody pulling the book out 10 years from now. See, in this book in Cornell University Press, it says that bleach will cure your COVID. You know, well, somebody said that. It's not true, right? I didn't want to promote that. But the other thing I would like to do, and I've actually thought about this, and anybody here, student, faculty, community resident, I've had thoughts about trying to create an oral history play out of this, in which actors would read excerpts from the interviews. It would require another very judicious selection from what we have, but I think it would be great because you would hear the voices of folks speaking through this, and because a play meets in public where people gather, it could prompt conversations among people about this experience and what we need to do going forward. And I think both of those would be really valuable.
Yeah, that sounds exciting. It sounds like something LaGuardia could take on. I actually do have one more question.
Sure.
I'm curious to hear, I mean, this is a New York audience.
Yep.
The book is a New York book. Obviously, COVID was not experienced the same way in other cities, in other parts of the country. How do you think this book might be received, or have you talked about this book outside of the 5 boroughs and felt any kind of difference, or is this something brand new to a lot of people that we've become a little bit accustomed to, knowing these stories?
I think it's a really great point. A couple books have come out about COVID, and they're very critical, and they tend to be very critical of public health officials, as if only those public health officials had not gotten in the way, things would have been fine. We would have been back, by October of 2020. I am deeply skeptical about these books, but I noticed that most of them ignore the hard days in New York City. I mean, they don't seem to want to draw any lessons from them that we could apply going forward. So I think it's important for people as near as the New York City suburbs to reckon with what was happening in New York City in the spring of 2020 before they make any decisions. The second thing is, I did talk to a lot of people who worked in public health, and their immense frustration during the pandemic was that nobody was listening to them. I mean, they were not dictating policy. They were being ignored. So to sort of beat up on them further as if they were dictators for a day in New York City just misleads people about their experience. I would like people to hear about it, think about it, read about it. I have relatives in Wyoming. They are somewhat skeptical about the idea that the pandemic was a national disaster. I think it was a national disaster. There was a report done on it that concluded if COVID was a war, we'd have to say the United States lost. They didn't buy that. They said, but not here in the heartland. To which I say, well, we're all Americans, aren't we? That some casualty rates were worse in some places than others doesn't diminish the scale of the disaster, right? At the same time, I remember in the summer of 2020 going up to the Adirondacks, expecting to find the most extreme COVID skepticism imaginable. And in every little town store that I visited, there was a sign in the window, no mask, no entry. Because they knew that people coming up from the city were more likely to be getting the virus than not. And they wanted to take the precautions that would keep them alive to tell their story another day.